That brings me to nations. How can a country, an entire nation, fall apart? Accept mediocrity, low expectations, like a bell, like the Los Angeles Clippers, and the current New Jersey Knicks. I looked around, and throughout time there have been some massive empires all around the world since the beginning of time. You know, we always learn about the Greek and Roman empires, but there have been some more modern empires that have been vastly larger that we don't learn a lot about. So I wanted to look at the top 3 in history, starting with number 3, the Russian Empire. It started as a small principality of Moscow in the 14th century. It grew like all great empires through military action and intimidation. The growth was sped up by Ivan the Terrible, who adopted the title of Tsar, and he lorded over a very brutal regime in the 15th century. By the time we had the reign of Peter the Great from 1672 to 1725, Russia was the largest state in the world. Its reach extended the Baltic Sea to the Pacific Ocean. During his rule, Kolops, who are essentially slaves, were converted into serfs. And the reason for this is that they were able to tax them, give them a special tax. Peter the Great had an army of 300,000 strong. He went to war with the Kingdom of Sweden, the Ottoman Turks, and he moved the capital of Russia to St. Petersburg. Then there was Catherine the Great. She was a very heavy-handed leader, but she was also very compelling in many ways. Through the Charter of Nobility, she actually enhanced the influence and power of the oligarchs, the land guys who owned all the land. She also allowed them to sell serfs separate from the land, which had been prohibited to that point. She expanded the empire to include the Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, and she chipped away at the Ottoman Empire. During her reign, Russia increased by more than 200,000 miles. She was actually also a diplomat. She started trade with Japan. She signed a treaty with Great Britain, and she helped to establish a League of Armed Neutrality. That brings us to Tsar Alexander I, who was a really young, idealistic guy, and he thought that he could actually bring liberty to the serf system. But guess what? The serfs were too entrenched in this feudal system. He was frustrated, so he turned his efforts away and said, I want to do something noble. So he decided to help take on Napoleon. Well, the first encounter wasn't that good. The Russo-Austrian army met Napoleon December 2nd, 1850. They suffered a humiliating defeat. Ultimately, Alexander cut a deal with Napoleon that allowed him to take over Finland. But by 1812, Napoleon invaded Russia with his grand army, 600,000 soldiers. They found very little resistance. In fact, it felt like they just marched straight through Russia, all the way to Moscow. Of course, by now, most of us know the story that it was a trap, that once he got to Moscow, it was burnt out. He also discovered winter was setting in. And then the counterattack began. Napoleon retreated. By the time he got back to France, he only had 40,000 men, or 7% of the amount he had when he went in. Of course, that whole thing inspired Tchaikovsky's 1812 overture. It also established Russia as a diplomatic and military leader among European nations. But through all of this conquering and all of these, as big as this country was, it missed out on the Industrial Revolution. The rest of Western Europe was adapting to that, but they couldn't because they were tied to a serf system. They also found it very difficult to maintain this country because of a centralized government, and that always kind of halted economic progress. Tsar Alexander II finally emancipated the serfs in 1861, 2 years before the Emancipation Proclamation in the United States. The Russian Empire officially ended in 1866. Then we have the Mongol Empire, which my son actually did learn about in school last year. You know, it's interesting because we always think of these guys as savages, you know, just on horseback killing anything that's moving. And essentially that's what they were, but they did have some good things. They established a trade route from China to the West. The Mongol Empire, though, I find hard to compare to America because they sort of remind me of Orson Welles in the sense that they were this supernova. They came on the scene, and you know they weren't there very long, but it was the second largest empire in history. The biggest empire in history was the British Empire. By 1914, the British Empire had 36.1 million kilometers. It controlled 20% of the Earth. The phrase, "the sun never sets on the British Empire," was accurate. Now you could trace back the beginning of this to Queen Elizabeth I, whose reign ran from 1558 to 1603. Her backing of voyages and exploration, particularly those of Sir Francis Drake. At its peak, the empire encompassed 400 million subjects. Falkland Islands, Africa, Pacific Ocean, Caribbean, Canada, India, and the 13 colonies. Initially, the British embraced the Industrial Revolution more so than their European counterparts, so it gave them the advantage of using steam, advanced weapons and communications, and it obviously helped them to completely overwhelm the peoples around the world that they ran into. The British felt that they were compelled to dominate the world, and they were driven by the 3 C's: Christianity, commerce, and civilization. Of course, it was the harsh treatment of its subjects that is a lingering legacy, though, of the British Empire. While the Christianity part reflected the Protestant ethic that so dominated in the New World that it was later written about by Max Weber as the basis of the astronomical advancement for the United States of America, the Protestant work ethic. The empire itself was very difficult to manage. It was a far-flung empire. The best people qualified to lead didn't want to leave. You know, listen, you had a choice. You can stay in London, or you can go to some outpost in some place with mosquitoes and restless natives. So for the most part, the people they got to run their global positions were mostly underqualified, often corrupt, and this actually led to even further mistreatment of their subjects. And this happened all over the world. In 1845, in fact, a Frenchman remarked, "I have seen the Indian in his forest and the Negro in his irons, and I believed in a pity their plight, that I saw the lowest ebb of human misery, but I did not then know the degree of poverty to be found in Ireland." That was during the middle of the potato famine that killed millions, that ended in 1851. In 1857, there was the Indian Rebellion that set into motion the eventual independence in India. By 1870, the U.S. economy was equal to Great Britain's economy. By 1914, the U.S. economy was 3 times the size of Great Britain's, but Great Britain still controlled the financial services market around the world, so it still had a certain amount of prestige. So again, you can be falling completely apart as a nation and still have a certain amount of prestige. And if you're not careful, you won't realize that your foundation is completely eroded. After World War II, Great Britain was bankrupt. It was on the verge of insolvency that was only averted by a $3.5 billion loan from the United States. That was 1946. Effectively, that was the end of the Great British Empire. By the way, the last installment that they pay us back on that loan was made in 2006. That's a little slow. I wonder how much interest we charge. Great Britain had long entered into a period of mediocrity before it actually peaked and cracked. The nation stopped backing innovation. In fact, most of the investments that Great Britain made in the last 40, 50 years of its might were made abroad. And I find that very interesting because here in America, from 2007 until the end of 2009, U.S. investors sold $207 billion of equity mutual funds that are designed to invest in American companies. They sold them. They got out of them. In the meantime, they invested $74 billion into funds designed to invest in foreign companies. Americans have begun to give up on America a long time ago. So here we are. We're at this crossroads. We're coming out of the 3rd worst recession in U.S. history with respect to lost GDP. And of course, things are still tough all over. You got 42 million people on food stamps, 14 million people unemployed, 10 million underemployed. That means they're working a part-time job, but they want and need a full-time job. 2 million people marginally detached. I mean, they're more or less eating a bowl of Fruit Loops and playing video games, but they want a job. And if you got one for them, come let them know. Actually, they looked a long time and they just kind of got frustrated.